Okay, so before we read through the book of Daniel, constantly happening to me. We need to discuss the character and nature of Daniel in terms of, did he really live? Was this really a character who lived in history? Did he minister? Did he live at the time he said he lived? Did he minister at the time he said he ministered? Daniel is so full of very specific prophecies about things that are going to happen centuries from his time. Remember, Daniel lived in the 500s BC. Actually, he lived he was probably born about 620 BC and lived into the 530s BC. Or something, we don't know exactly. So basically the 500s BC. He's going to be talking about history all the way down, essentially, to the time of Jesus, and even beyond, to the second fall of Jerusalem. Remember, Daniel's talking during a time when Jerusalem was already a pile of rubble. And his book basically ends with a prediction and a certainty that's going to happen again. Jerusalem is going to once again end up as a pile of rubble. And that happens in 70 AD. So that's 600 years after his time. And during that, he covers several periods of history in very specific detail. He covers the Grecian period of history in very specific detail. Now, he lives through the Babylonian era and into the Persian era. So he sees that changeover happen from Babylon to Persia. He's going to predict that the Persians are eventually going to fall to the Greeks. That happens 200 years later. He's going to predict even how they fall to the Greeks, or at least he gives us some pretty specific information about that. That happens 200 years after the book of Daniel ends. He's also going to talk about what happens during the Grecian Empire, and in particular how that relates to the Holy Land, Israel, in the era of the divisions of the Greek Empire. And that's in the 300s and the 200s and the 100s BC. So that covers 300, 400, 500 years after Daniel, okay? And he goes in even to the Romans and talks about the kingdom that arises after the Romans. He doesn't name that one. He does name Babylon, Persia, and Greece, but he does not name the one that replaces Greece. We turn to Revelation to get that. Revelation will give us identification specifically of that. He does, however, identify, not name, but he mentions the first 11 rulers of this empire. This fourth empire, Rome. We can identify those in history as the first 11 emperors, Caesars. And so it's pretty specific. And like I said, and in chapter 11, he gives very specific information about how different kings within the Grecian Empire that are going to rule over the land of Israel are going to interact with each other, and how the people in Israel are going to be affected by that. And that's in the 200s and 100s BC. And he's living in the 500s BC, so this is 300, 400 years beyond his time, and the information is very specific. So, of course, if Daniel is what he says he is, the book of Daniel itself is pretty close to positive proof of the existence of God, because nobody could possibly predict the future this far in advance, this specifically, this accurately. Like, that's impossible. We talk about the predictive element of prophecy. I mentioned that earlier. I mentioned in a lot of my videos about prophecy. And that, yes, prophecy had a predictive element. But prophecy itself wasn't about predicting the future. That was just simply a part of it. And usually that predictive element had to do with warning the people about repenting or else facing judgment for their sins. And then also about what was going to happen after that when God restored them and restored the kingdom for them. Generally speaking, now we've had some very, Isaiah talked about Cyrus 200 years before Cyrus comes along. Cyrus is the guy who's going to lead the Persian Empire into Babylon and take out Babylon and replace Babylon with Persia. That happens in the time of Daniel. Read about that in the book of Daniel. Isaiah said that was going to happen in the late 700s BC, 160 plus years before it did. Of course, that causes people problems, so they want to say that Isaiah didn't actually write that. Daniel causes people a lot of problems. Because if you admit that Daniel is what it says it is, then you pretty much are forced to acknowledge that Daniel got his information from God. Because there's no way that Daniel could possibly have said all this stuff and been this accurate and this specific about it this far in advance without getting revelation straight from a God who knows everything. So Daniel gets attacked a lot, okay? This is one of those books, probably more than almost any other book, at least almost any other Old Testament book, that gets blasted and picked apart by the critics who want to find any reason they can get their mitts on to believe that Daniel was not written by the guy or in the time that it says it was written by, or written in. So the basic idea, okay, so that's that. So like I said, and we'll see the evidences of this. Like we'll see the demonstration of this as we read through the book of Daniel. We get to these prophecies, and we see how specific they are and how far in advance they are, and we realize, well, and how they were fulfilled, and how we have historical documents to demonstrate how precisely they were fulfilled. It's like, okay, well, this could not have been spoken 400 years in advance by somebody who was just winging it. Okay? There's two possibilities. Either Daniel got his information straight from a divine source who knows everything, even before it happens, or some guy is actually writing history, some guy from 400 years later is actually writing history because he knows what already happened. And that, of course, is the perspective that the smart people want to focus on. They want to say that some dude in about 150 BC or whatever is writing this book, pretending to be Daniel, and is fooling everybody into thinking that he's writing prophecy when he's actually writing history and acting like it's something that hasn't happened yet. That's a smart person's perspective. Now, we've seen how smart these smart people are in the era of COVID when they've gotten basically everything wrong. Okay? It's like COVID and our idiotic, stupid overreaction to COVID has demonstrated quite self-sufficiently, I would say, that our smart people are not really all that smart, and they tend to get basically everything wrong. They're not very smart, actually, in the grand scheme of things. So on the one hand, it's like I feel like I almost don't even have to do this because the smart people have done a very good job of themselves, demonstrating quite publicly how unsmart they actually are. But to be thorough, we're going to talk about some of these objections to the book of Daniel, and we're going to refute them. Now, some of this we're going to do as we read through the book. As we come upon specific parts of Daniel that the critics object to, we'll deal with them as we get there. But I want to cover some things in general here that we can, some criticisms or some objections raised by the critics that we can deal with in a more general sense before we get started. For one thing, the simplest explanation, I don't know what the simplest explanation would be. I probably shouldn't say it that way. We have copies or fragments of copies of the book of Daniel that date from around the time that the smart people say the book was written. Okay, so basically the idea here is that, and we'll cover this when we get to the sections that deal with it in detail, but essentially, in around the 160s BC, there was a king, of part of the Grecian Empire that was north of Israel, who had major problems with the Jews and the God of the Jews, and he waged war against them for several years in the 160s BC. And so this is a dude named Antiochus IV, because there had been 3 Antiochuses before him, and he gave himself the title Epiphanes, which means, manifest, divine will manifest. He thought he was a big deal. He thought he was big stuff. And he hated God, he hated the Jewish God, and he hated Jews. And so for a few years, and he was king over that land. So he attacked the people that he was king over very viciously. He desecrated the temple, which was standing at that time. He sacrificed a pig there. He built an altar to Zeus there. He desecrated it and fought against the people of the Holy Land, the beautiful land, as it's called in Daniel, very aggressively for a period of 3 or 4 years. They fought back. There was a resistance to him, and primarily in the form of these Maccabees. Have you ever heard of the Maccabees or the Maccabeans? That's who they were. They were a family who led the resistance against Antiochus Epiphanes. They eventually won. And they didn't kill Antiochus himself. As the book of Daniel itself will even predict, Antiochus ends up dying, not by human hand. So he does not get killed or die in battle, but he is fought and resisted, ultimately successfully, by an opposing army, who essentially take over Israel, and for about 100 years, they have independence again. And from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century BC, until the Romans come. And of course, so the smart people's opinion is that this book of Daniel was written during that time, or around that time, when the Antiochus Epiphanes, who is featured prominently in the book of Daniel. We're going to talk about him in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11, and he's going to be linked with another character from Daniel chapter 7 and 12 that are not him, but he's considered to be like a type of. So this guy, who in history we know as Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is a very important figure in Daniel. Not named specifically, but is identified as a major future enemy of the Jews and the people of God. And he is also linked with another character in a couple other chapters who's going to be similar, who are going to be very hostile and aggressive and actively fight against the people of God. And so that happened, and that was in the 170s, 160s BC, and so so the smart people's idea is that Daniel was really written during that time, and somebody just kind of forged it and pretended to be Daniel, and acted like he was writing from 400 years earlier about things that hadn't happened yet. But they actually had happened, so he knew about them, so that's why he's able to be so specific in his prophecies. Now ultimately the reason why, there's actually no supporting evidence for this. In fact, if you actually look into this, there's every piece of evidence you could look for or want to be interested in indicates this is not correct. Okay, as I was about to say earlier, we have copies or fragments of copies of the book of Daniel from that time period, from the 100s BC or so, or shortly thereafter, like 50 years later, which would indicate that Daniel wasn't written then if it was already being distributed and held as canonical, revered as a canonical book of the scriptures. It's not going to happen in 50 years. Okay, so basically the idea is that when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, Daniel was part of them. There were fragments of Daniel amongst them. In fact, there were several fragments of Daniel. There are as many fragments of Daniel as many other books in the Bible. So it's like they had, and that was in about the 100, around 100 BC. And so, even in that mindset, it's like by around the time that smart people say Daniel was written, we already have copies of the book of Daniel, fragments of it from the book of Daniel, from around that same time period or very shortly thereafter, which is basically not possible if the book was really only written 50 years earlier. We have copies of fragments of Daniel that go back to about 100 BC. If the book was written 50 years before that, it's not going to have time to be distributed or canonized to that degree, as evidenced by its prominence in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran case. So we know that Daniel was more widely distributed during that same time period in which it was allegedly written than what it would be if it had been written then. We also, the idea, of course, is that it was written from a Grecian perspective because it was written during the time of the Greek Empire. And to prove this, evidence is brought out that there are 3 Greek words in Daniel, which are all instruments in Daniel chapter 3. Some of the instruments mentioned in Daniel chapter 3 are Grecian words. The problem with this thinking is that if the book was actually written during a time of Grecian dominance, there would be a lot more than 3 Grecian words in the book of Daniel. And also, the simplest refutation of the idea that Daniel was all written history as prophecy is the idea that the book of Daniel's prophecies go 100 or 200 years even beyond the time in which it was supposedly written. Daniel's prophecies go all the way down to the establishment of the kingdom and even the fall of Jerusalem for the second time in 70 AD. And we know Daniel existed before then because we have copies of the book from a couple hundred years before that. So even there, it's like the whole argument of Daniel being history written as prophecy falls apart because Daniel's prophecy, or Daniel's scope of history goes beyond the point where the smart people say the book was actually written. A couple centuries beyond that, actually. And of course, the biggest and most damning flaw of the critical approach is that in Daniel chapter 5, Daniel correctly names and identifies the king who was in charge of Babylon the night it fell, and that was a guy named Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was a figure who had been lost to history for 2,200 plus years. Nobody knew who Belshazzar was from the mid-400s BC when the Greeks started going up against the Persians to the 1850s AD, when they finally found the city of Babylon and began excavating it and found cylinders and tablets that had the name of Belshazzar on them and the son of Nabonidus. The mention of Belshazzar in Daniel had been for hundreds of years taken as proof that Daniel got it wrong, because the Greek historian Herodotus in the 400s BC, only 100 years after Daniel, wrote that the king of Babylon was Nabonidus and said nothing about Belshazzar. So from then on, and of course, since he's a Greek, and we love the Greeks since they're white, and they were the precursors to the Enlightenment, so we had to put the Greeks on a pedestal because they basically were the forerunner of European dominance, which we all love. So because Herodotus is a Greek and the father of history, we have to put his writings on a sacred pedestal. And since he said nothing about Belshazzar, because he didn't know anything about Belshazzar, we had to assume for 2,200 years that there was no Belshazzar, until we found out, in fact, that there was, in fact, a Belshazzar, who was, in fact, king of the city of Babylon on the night it fell, because his father Nabonidus was not in Babylon at that time, and had not been, actually, for several years. He was not. The actual top guy was not living in Babylon, had not lived in Babylon for 10 years. So, because the Greeks knew nothing about Belshazzar, we could not then identify Belshazzar as the king of Babylon, and we had to assume that Daniel was wrong. We have since proven that Daniel was in fact right. The Greeks were not wrong, were not right. So the entire criticism of putting Daniel's writings in the time of the Greeks, therefore, is fundamentally and fatally flawed. We will talk more about these specific aspects of the criticism of the book of Daniel as we go through the book. In fact, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about that. That's actually going to be kind of like the focus of our attention, especially in these first 6 chapters, which really aren't that difficult from a theological perspective. For the most part, these first 6 chapters of Daniel are not going to be very difficult to comprehend or understand, except for trying to get a wrap around how it actually fits into history. It's the second half of Daniel which gets tricky, in terms of its content and its theological messaging. So we will cover some more of these specific items on the itinerary as we go through the book of Daniel. But the essential point here is that the smart people want to say that Daniel was written 400 years after it was actually written. But the smart people aren't very smart, as we have all seen evidenced quite clearly and repeatedly and publicly during COVID. The smart people aren't very smart, and they're not right about this. They weren't right about COVID, they're not right about this. And in fact, their own arguments end up defeating them, because the very argument they used to use to disprove the providence of Daniel has thus proven the providence of Daniel and proven the critics' argument wrong. So we can be assured that in the end, the main reason why anybody would want to dismiss the book of Daniel is because it's pretty close to being positive proof of the existence of God. There really isn't any way, there's really only 2 explanations for how Daniel exists the way it does. One is if the critics are right, and it was really a history written as prophecy, and it was just a big forgery that fooled everyone. And even there, you do have this idea of arrogance on the part of the critics. The idea is that this forgery fooled everybody until us smart white people figured it out like 2,000 years later. I mean, in the end, that is ultimately what we're saying. Nobody in antiquity thought that Daniel was a forgery, until I think somebody in like the 3rd or 4th century AD, when he was dismissed. Okay? You have to go, like I said, from the time Daniel was written, you have to go about 700 years into the future to find anybody who thought it was a forgery, and even that guy was the only one until basically the European Enlightenment of the 1800s. And in the end, that whole idea, that whole mindset is rooted in what some people today would call white supremacy, and that us smart white people had figured out what these ancient dumb guys thought. Like, they were all fooled. They were all taken in by this forgery. But us smart white people living 2,000 years later, we saw through it. We figured it out. And that is ultimately the attitude you have to have in order to believe this. It just is. Like, that's the sort of mindset you need to have in order to accept that what you're saying is true. So it says a lot about you. Like, if you're someone who believes this, you're inadvertently kind of revealing something about your own belief system when you say that. And fundamentally, the reason why you would want to take this approach is you just simply don't want to believe in Daniel as God. Like I said, there's really only two possible explanations for how Daniel could exist the way it does. One of them is that it was actually history written as prophecy, although again, the book of Daniel's prophecies go 2 centuries even beyond where the people say they go to. And secondly is that, well, some guy named Daniel really got information from some divine being who knows everything. I mean, those are the only two possibilities. We've proven that one doesn't work, and that leaves the other. So in the end, it's like it's up to you to decide. Are you going to accept this fatally flawed, morally questionable perspective that says more about your belief system than anything else? Or are you going to accept the book of Daniel for what it claims to be? That's what it comes down to.